These percentage tips left me. Hello everybody, and welcome back to another fresh episode of Bowmaths. Do you smell that? Because I've been cooking some fresh percentage tricks. And today I'm going to be showing you 3 of them. So if you can notice the form that these percentage tricks take, you're going to be well on your way to doing some quick maths. So the first trick I like to call the 10%er. And just to demonstrate what it looks like, let's just say I do something like, let's say 40% of 30. Now I know right off the bat that's 12. How did I know that? Did I just have it ahead of time? I did not. I just used the 10%er trick. So the way this works is that let's first of all write out what 40% of 30 looks like when we're doing the full calculation, and I'll show you where the simplifications can be made that enabled me to do this mentally. So if we do 40% of 30, right, that's just multiplying 30. We can convert 40% into a fraction. So that's going to be 40 out of 100. And then multiplying it by the 30, that's going to be times 30 over 1. And what we're going to end up getting is we're going to be getting 1200 on the top divided by 100 in the denominator. And there's a decimal right here, and when we slide that decimal over by 2, which the division by 100 tells us to do, we're going to get 12. So we do see that this works, but where was the trick that I used? Well, let's look at 1200. Notice that 1200, that's made up of 40 times 30, right? And 40 is the same thing as 4 times 10, and 30 is the same as 3 times 10, right? So if I rearrange this, I get 4 times 3 times 10 times 10. And what's 10 times 10? Well, that's just 100, right? So we get 4 times 3 times 100. Okay, so this is where the magic happens, because notice, we're doing 1200 divided by 100. The division by 100 is just going to basically eliminate this factor of multiplying by 100, because division undoes multiplication, right? If I do 5 times 4, I get 20. If I divide it by 4, I get back to 5, right? So because this 100 here is going to get canceled out by the division by 100, notice it's just the 4 times 3 that gets left over, which is the 12 that we see right there. So the reason this works is because 40% was a multiple of 10 and 30% was a multiple of 10. So the form for this trick then is if your percent is a multiple of 10 and the number you have next to it is also a multiple of 10. All right, so if your percent is a multiple of 10, right, 40 is a multiple of 10, and your number is a multiple of 10, so is 30, then you can ignore the rightmost zero and then multiply. So I ignore the zeros on both of them, and we get 4 times 3, which is 12. So let's do some more examples. Let's say I did like 30% of 90. Okay, so to do this, we notice that they're both a multiple of 10, so I can ignore the zeros, and we just have 3 times 9, which is 27. That's 30% of 90. All right, let's do another one. What's 70% of 30? Well, once again, both multiple of 10. I ignore the zeros. I get 7 times 3. So 21 is going to be 70% of 30. Let's try another one. What's 120% of 120? Okay, so it's bigger than 100, but we know we can do percents that are bigger than 100. But they are both multiples of 10, right? They both end in a 0. So we just cancel those out. We get 12 times 12. That's 144. So 144 is 120% of 20. And let's try one more that's maybe a little tougher. So what's 20% of 3,400? So they're both multiples of 10, right? They end in a 0. But notice, it's canceled the rightmost zero. So we're not getting rid of all of the zeros here. We're just getting rid of one of the zeros. So we're looking at 2 times 340, which is going to be 680. So 680 is going to be 20% of 3,400. All right, so I hope you got that trick locked in. But if not, you can always do some more practice. Just choose a percent that's a multiple of 10 and choose a number that's a multiple of 10 and take that percent of that number. Let's go on to trick number 2. I don't really know if there's a name for it, so I just call it the percent Flippy trick. All right, so to demonstrate once again, let's say I had something like 22% of 50. I know that that's immediately 11. How did I know that? Well, I used the percent Flippy trick. So what you do is, if we do 22% of 50, that's going to be the same thing as 22 over 100 times 50, right? But this is just 50 over 1, and we get 22 times 50 over 100 times 1. Now, the reason I'm writing this times 1 here is because I'm going to flip the order of the 100 and the 1, because order of multiplication doesn't matter, and we end up getting 22 times 50 over 1 times 100. And the reason I've written in this order is now I'm going to undo kind of this single fraction make it into a product of two fractions, so that's going to be 22 over 1 times 50 over 100. But then flipping once again, this 50 over 100 becomes 50%, right? And the 22 over 1 is just 22. So notice what happened. I exchanged the roles of the percent with the number, noting that 22% of 50 is the same as 50% of 22. Because I was able to exchange these roles, this calculation became a lot easier. Because 50% of 22, remember 50%, that's just 1/2. So all I'm doing is taking half of 22, which I knew to be 11. So that's the percent Flippy trick. You can exchange the role of the percent and the number. Right, so let's try some examples. So say I did 142% of 50. Well, I know this is the same thing as 50% of 142, right? I'm just using the Flippy trick. I'm just changing them around. And the 50% of 142, that's half of that, right? And half of 142 is 71. So boom, 142% of 50 is 71. So let's say I did something like, what's 72% of 10? Well, that's the same thing as 10% of 72. And if you recall, 10% is just 1 over 10, right? That's 10 over 100, which simplifies to 1 over 10, right? So this becomes 1 over 10 times 72, which becomes 72 divided by 10, which then becomes 7.2. So maybe, depending on how comfortable you are with this, you still have to put in this extra step, but it's still easier than writing 72 over 100 times 10 and doing all of the extra work there. Now, this isn't always going to be easier, right? If I said something like 7% of 33, well, it's probably not necessarily easier to do 33% of 7, right? So you have to kind of pick your battles with these. But if you notice a situation where you think, oh man, it would have been nice if this number here was the percent instead, because it's easy to do 50% or it's easy to do 10%. Well, then just change it around, right? And then you can use this trick, right? So it's one of those things where it's good to practice with tricks of this form so that if it happens to come about, right? That's the thing with these mental math tricks, right? They're not always useful, but it's good to be practiced with them because sometimes when it happens, you'll kind of just have that instinct reaction to use it, and you're going to have simplified the problem a lot faster, and you're going to feel pretty chuffed with yourself for remembering the trick. So let's move on to the last trick, which in my opinion is actually going to be the most clever of the three tricks. All right, so this third trick is called the old 90% trick, or that's what I like to call it. So if we do 90% of some number, let's say, I don't know, 430, okay, I know right off the bat that is going to be 387. Okay, how did I figure that out? That looks a lot more daunting than the other ones. So before I explain this, let's first of all make sure that we're comfortable with applying 10% to things. So note, 10% is just 10 over 100, which is 1 over 10, right? And anything times 1 over 10, for example, 3 times 1 over 10, that ends up being just dividing by 10, right? This is, if you recall the double action stuff, this 1 here is just the action of stretching by 1, which does nothing, and then this 10 here is the action of compressing by 10, which is division by 10, right? So if I multiply anything by this fraction, it's going to result in division by 10. What that means is that when I multiply anything by 10%, I'm just going to be dividing it by 10. That means 10% of 42, just divide it by 10, slide the decimal over by 1, I get 4.2. 10% of 798, well, that is a messed up 8. 798 That's going to be 79.8, right? I'm just sliding the decimal over by 1 because 10% is just division by 10. So this is just a side note. I mean, I guess in some sense that's kind of a percentage trick in and of itself. But what we can do with this is note that if we're doing 90% of 430, well, 100% of 430 is just itself, right? 100% of anything, it's just doing 1 times that thing, essentially. So that means that 90% of 430, that should be the same thing as taking 430 and removing 10% from it, right? If we remove 10% of 430 from 430, we're going to be left with just the 90%, right? And as we just saw, it's really easy to calculate the 10% of something. So then what I actually did for this trick is I did 10% of 430, which gives me 43, right? Just taking this decimal, sliding it over by 1. And then I'm taking 430, and I'm subtracting the 43. And I just did that mentally. And we see we end up getting 387. Even though it's not necessarily easy to multiply by 90%, we can multiply by 10% and then just subtract that off. So this process of switching the 90% for the 10%, that does actually have a name in math. This is called using the complement of 90%. So basically it's what completes 90% to make it 100. So 10% is the complement of 90%, 20% would be the complement of 80%, 40% would be the complement of 60%, and so on and so forth. You don't really have to worry about that right now. That's a more advanced topic that's used for other areas of math, but just in case, that's what this is called. All right, so if you're taking 90% of some number, right, 90% of 430, it's the same as subtracting off 10% of the number from itself. So let's do some examples. Let's say I had 90% of 71. Okay, so 90% of 71. So what we're going to do is we're going to do this is the same thing as 71 minus 10% of itself. 10% of 71 just takes the decimal, slides it over, right? 10% is just division by 10. So it's going to be 71 minus 7.1. And that should be 63.9. All right, so some of these, the mental math, depending on how comfortable you are with doing subtraction in your head, that might not have been super easy for you, but it still simplifies the process. We avoided having to do 90 times 71 and then dividing it by 100, right? And that's a big thing with mental math tricks. It's not necessarily something you can do entirely in your head, but it's something that greatly simplifies the process and saves you a lot of mental energy. So let's try another one. What's 90% of 891? All right, so that's going to be the same thing as 891 minus 10% of itself. And 10% of 891 is just 89.1. So we're looking at 891 minus 89.1. And that is going to be, should be 801.9. If you want some practice with this, just take 90% of any number and get used to practicing subtracting off 10% of itself, and you will be a master of the old 90% trick in no time. So I hope you found this video interesting. You're now equipped with 3 fascinating and useful percentage tricks that may just utterly gobsmack the next person you use it on. So be responsible, be quick, and be epic with your mathematics usage. But until the next video, you have a good one, you stay groovy, and I'll see you then.
He's so fast.